July 1st, 1944, Hollandia Air Base, New Guinea. 4 P-38 Lightning aircraft land after 6.5 hours of flying over enemy territory. 3 pilots exit their planes with fuel gauges nearly empty, perhaps only 50 gallons remaining in their tanks. The 4th plane, piloted by a 42-year-old civilian, still has 210 gallons left. Same mission, same weather, same aircraft, yet this pilot has somehow used 200 gallons less fuel than the top fighter pilots in the Pacific. The ground crew chief checks the fuel stick again, confused. For months, American pilots had flown these twin-engine fighters exactly as the manual instructed, adhering to 2200 RPM and Auto-Rich mixture settings, following every procedure drilled into them since flight school. They were told that deviating from these guidelines would damage their engines, and running high manifold pressure with low RPM was aviation suicide. But now, standing on that New Guinea airstrip, looking at fuel readings that defied everything they knew about engine management, a single question lingered in the hot Pacific air. What if everything they had been taught about flying was wrong? The checker game had been going on for 20 minutes when a knock came at the screen door. Colonel Charles MacDonald barely glanced up from the red and black squares, his mind still focused on the game, while the afternoon heat pressed down on their makeshift headquarters at Hollandia Air Base. Lieutenant Colonel Merrill Smith sat across from him, equally absorbed in their only diversion, one of the few available in the remote area of Netherlands, New Guinea. "Excuse me, gentlemen," a voice called with quiet authority. MacDonald finally looked up. Standing at the doorway was a middle-aged man in navy khakis, his uniform neat despite the humidity. "I'm Charles Lindbergh." MacDonald's hand froze mid-motion as the name hung in the air, evoking memories of a legendary aviator. Smith's eyes widened, but MacDonald found himself staring at the unremarkable civilian, trying to reconcile the history of Lindbergh with the man standing before them. "That Charles Lindbergh, the one who flew solo to Paris 17 years ago?" MacDonald muttered in disbelief. "General Hutchinson sent me," Lindbergh said, stepping inside. "He thought I might have some insights on P-38 combat operations." MacDonald stood up slowly, the checker game forgotten. At just 29 years old, he commanded the 475th Fighter Group, but he'd grown up reading about Lindbergh's iconic Atlantic crossing. Every pilot in America revered the Spirit of St. Louis, a symbol of how flying had evolved from a circus act to legitimate transportation. And now, the same man was standing in their tent, ready to discuss the daily challenges of flying across the vast Pacific. "Of course, Mr. Lindbergh, please, sit down," MacDonald said, gesturing to a folding chair and calling for Colonel Warren Lewis to join them. If they were going to discuss P-38 operations, Lewis had to be there. Lewis, the commanding officer of the 433rd Fighter Squadron, understood the harsh realities of their current situation better than anyone. Lewis arrived shortly, still damp with sweat from the morning briefing. He took one glance at their unexpected guest, and his composed military demeanor cracked slightly. "Mr. Lindbergh, what brings you to our little corner of paradise?" The irony wasn't lost on any of them. Paradise? If it could be called that, it consisted of metal hangars, baking in the tropical sun, never drying mud, and an endless battle against insects immune to every repellent the quartermaster had issued. But Lewis's question was sincere. What could the most famous aviator in the world want with their daily struggle? "I'm here to learn," Lindbergh replied simply, "and perhaps to share some thoughts on long-range flying." Lewis settled into another folding chair, and MacDonald could see him shifting into briefing mode. "Well, Mr. Lindbergh, our situation is pretty straightforward. We're flying missions that push these aircraft to their limits," he said, spreading out a worn map across MacDonald's desk, pushing aside the checkerboard. His finger traced the routes across hundreds of miles of Pacific Ocean, dotted with tiny islands that looked insignificant on paper, but represented crucial navigation points for pilots flying alone over the endless water. 6 and 12 to 7 hours, Lewis continued, his tone measured. "That's what we're asking from these boys now." Missions that were impossible a year ago are becoming routine, but the fuel margins... He shook his head. MacDonald could see Lindbergh's eyes, focused intently on the map, calculating distances with the precision of someone who had spent decades thinking about range and endurance. It was the gaze of a pilot who understood that fuel was more than just a number on a gauge. It was time, distance, and ultimately, survival. The P-38L has a published combat radius of 570 miles, Lewis explained. In practice, we're pushing that to the limit every single mission. Standard procedure calls for 2200 to 2400 RPM and auto-rich mixture settings. Fuel consumption is over 100 gallons per hour total. Lindbergh nodded slowly, but MacDonald noticed something in his expression. Not confusion, but recognition. It was as though he knew exactly what they were dealing with, even before they explained it. The pilots returned exhausted, their bodies feeling the strain of the long mission. 7 hours in that cockpit is pure torture, Lewis continued. Sitting on a parachute, emergency raft and gear. The physical strain is one thing, but the mental pressure is another. He gestured to the map again. Every mission brief is a fuel calculation. How much reserve? How long can we stay over the target? What's our absolute point of no return? MacDonald had witnessed that pressure firsthand. Young pilots, some not even 21, hunched over flight planning tables with slide rules and pencils, calculating margins that would determine whether they'd see another sunrise. Too many good men had already been lost to empty tanks instead of enemy fire. The math was unforgiving. Run out of fuel over the Pacific, and rescue was a slim chance at best. And it's getting worse, Lewis added quietly. The targets are getting farther away. Rabaul Waywalk. Now we're talking about missions deep into the Philippines. The war is moving west, but our fuel capacity isn't keeping up. Lindbergh listened intently without interrupting, occasionally asking technical questions about mixture settings, propeller pitch, or cruise altitudes. His questions were specific and technical, revealing a depth of knowledge about aircraft systems that surprised MacDonald. This wasn't just a famous name asking polite questions. This was a pilot who truly understood power plant management, far beyond what most combat flyers ever learned. Have you experimented with different cruise settings? Lindbergh asked after a moment. Lewis and MacDonald exchanged a glance. The technical orders are pretty specific, Lewis replied carefully. We follow standard procedures for engine management, high RPM, rich mixtures. That's what keeps these Allisons running. Something in Lindbergh's expression shifted, almost imperceptibly. Not disagreement, but the look of someone who had heard conventional wisdom that didn't align with his own experience. Mr. Lindbergh, MacDonald said slowly, you mentioned having some observations about long-range flying. What kind of observations? For the first time since entering their quarters, Lindbergh smiled slightly. Would you be interested in a practical demonstration? He asked. I checked out the P-38 a few days ago, flying Dick Bong's old aircraft to the base. I'd like to join one of your combat missions. The request hung in the air, thick with the weight of command. Taking a civilian, even Charles Lindbergh, on a combat mission was a risk that went far beyond normal mission parameters. But something about the man's quiet confidence suggested this wasn't just idle curiosity. What did you have in mind? MacDonald asked. The recreation hall at Hollandia had seen better days, though MacDonald couldn't recall when. The dirt floors, packed hard by months of foot traffic, and the palm thatch roof that leaked during afternoon rains gave it a tired look. A single ping-pong table stood as the squadron's primary form of entertainment when they weren't flying or maintaining aircraft. Unshaded light bulbs hung from the rafters, casting harsh shadows that made everyone look older. And wearier than they were, MacDonald stood near a makeshift podium, really. Just a wooden crate turned on its end and surveyed the assembled pilots of the 475th Fighter. Group, 43 men, most under 25, all wearing the 1,000-yard stare that came from too many hours spent flying over hostile territory, constantly calculating fuel margins. Some perched on folding chairs, scavenged from various supply dumps. Others sat cross-legged on the floor, and a few leaned against the walls with their arms crossed. "Gentlemen," MacDonald began, his voice cutting through the murmur of conversation, "Mr. Lindbergh has something to share about extending our range capabilities." Lindbergh stepped forward with the calm confidence of someone used to speaking in front of skeptical audiences. He wore the same navy khakis from their earlier meeting, but now MacDonald noticed the small details that marked him as different from the standard military issue: the civilian watch, the absence of regulation insignia, and the way he moved with an unconscious grace that came from decades spent around aircraft. "Reduce your standard 2200 RPM to 1600, Lindbergh said without preamble. No warm-up, no context, just a technical specification that could either save lives or destroy engines. "Set fuel mixtures to auto-lean instead of auto-rich. Increase manifold pressures slightly to compensate." The silence that followed was the kind MacDonald had heard before. Not confusion, but the mental grinding of pilots trying to reconcile what they'd just heard with everything they had been taught. Lieutenant Bobby Johnson, one of their best formation leaders, raised his hand hesitantly. "Sir, are you saying we can drop RPM to 1600 and use 30 inches of mercury for manifold pressure?" "That's correct," Lindbergh replied. "The fuel savings run between 50 and 100 gallons per mission, depending on conditions and flight duration." The silence deepened. MacDonald observed his pilots' faces, reading the mix of hope and fear playing across their features. Hope because longer range meant better chances of survival, more flexibility, and the ability to reach targets that had previously been out of reach. Fear because every flight instructor, every technical manual, every engine expert had drilled into them that deviating from standard procedures could cause disaster. The school had taught them the same core principle: never run over square. Captain Jim Watkins voiced what everyone was thinking. "Mr. Lindbergh, that's going to burn up our engines. We've always been told that low RPM with high manifold pressure causes detonation." "You've been told wrong," Lindbergh interrupted, his voice carrying the quiet authority of absolute confidence. "The technique works because you're maintaining high manifold pressure while reducing RPM, not running both high at the same time. Combined with auto-lean mixture settings instead of auto-rich, this reduces fuel consumption to about 70 gallons per hour total." Lieutenant Thomas Hayes, barely 22 and still carrying the eagerness of someone who'd graduated flight school 6 months earlier, did the math aloud. 70 gallons per hour versus our current 100 plus. "That's almost a 30% reduction." "More than that," Lindbergh replied. "Flying at 185 mph indicated airspeed, this technique provides roughly 2.6 miles per gallon. Your combat radius extends from 570 miles to 700, possibly 750 miles, depending on conditions." The numbers hung in the humid air like unexploded artillery shells, waiting to detonate. MacDonald could see the pilots running calculations in their heads, trying to understand what those figures meant in practical terms. A 750-mile combat radius meant missions they had previously considered impossible. Deep strikes into Japanese-held territory that had been out of their fuel range. But the resistance went beyond mathematics. These men had survived by following procedures that kept their engines running and their planes flying. The Allison V-1710 engines in their P-38s were temperamental under the best of conditions. Tampering with the established settings felt like gambling with their lives. "Sir," said Major Pete Peterson, a veteran of missions over Rabaul, his skepticism hard-earned, "every technical order we've seen warns against over-square operation due to the risk of engine knock and piston damage. The procedure appears controversial because you've been trained to believe it would damage the engines," Lindbergh replied calmly. "But consider the source of that training. How many of your instructors had experience with sustained long-range cruise flights? How many had operated these specific power plants under extended endurance conditions?" The question hit at the heart of their dilemma. Military flight training focused on combat maneuvering, formation flying, and gunnery, not the efficient long-range cruise techniques that Lindbergh had mastered in civilian aviation. The technical orders were written by engineers who prioritized engine longevity over operational range, assuming that fuel capacity, not consumption, would determine mission limits. Lieutenant Colonel Smith, who had remained quiet during Lindbergh's explanation, finally spoke up. "Mr. Lindbergh, you're asking us to fly 9-hour missions. 7 hours in a lightning cockpit is already torture. Sitting on emergency gear, dealing with oxygen system quirks, fighting fatigue that clouds judgment." He gestured to the gathered pilots. 9 hours seems beyond human endurance. MacDonald nodded grimly. The physical challenges were real and couldn't be overlooked. The P-38 cockpit was cramped even under the best circumstances, and long missions meant sitting on parachutes, emergency rafts, and survival gear for hours at a time. Oxygen masks became increasingly uncomfortable. Radio headsets created pressure points. The mental strain of navigating over featureless ocean wore down even experienced pilots. "The endurance challenge is legitimate," Lindbergh acknowledged. "But consider the alternative. How many pilots have you lost to fuel starvation? How many missions have been aborted because fuel margins didn't allow enough time over target?" The question struck a nerve because every pilot in the room knew the answers. Too many had disappeared over the Pacific, their planes vanishing when fuel ran out hundreds of miles from land. Others had been forced to turn back before reaching their targets, leaving enemy installations intact due to insufficient fuel to complete their missions. "The choice isn't between comfort and discomfort," Lindbergh continued softly. "It's between proven techniques that extend your operational capability and conventional methods that may be limiting your effectiveness unnecessarily." MacDonald studied the faces around him, reading the mixture of curiosity and concern in their expressions. These were combat veterans who had learned to trust their equipment and training, but they were also pragmatists who understood that survival often meant adapting to new information. "Mr. Lindbergh," MacDonald said finally, "would you be willing to demonstrate this technique on an actual combat mission?" The morning of July 3rd dawned clear over Hollandia, the visibility stretching to the horizon for the first time in a week. MacDonald stood beside his P-38 Lightning at 5:30, watching ground crews complete their pre-flight inspections as the tropical air still carried the coolness of night. Today's mission would test everything Lindbergh had claimed about fuel management, a 1280-mile round trip that would push even conventional fuel planning to its limits. Lindbergh emerged from the operations tent, carrying his flight gear with the deliberate movements of someone who had performed this ritual thousands of times. Lindbergh's borrowed flight suit fit reasonably well, though MacDonald noticed he wore civilian flying boots instead of the standard military issue. More telling was the ease with which Lindbergh handled his equipment: parachute harness, Mae West life jacket, oxygen mask, and survival kit, all arranged with the efficiency of long practice. "The weather looks good for the demonstration," Lindbergh observed, glancing toward the eastern horizon where the sun was starting to burn off the overnight haze. "Visibility should remain clear for navigation, and the winds are minimal." MacDonald nodded, though his attention was focused on the fuel calculations. He'd run the numbers 3 times overnight. Standard cruise settings would require every drop of internal fuel capacity, leaving virtually no reserve for combat maneuvering or unexpected headwinds. If Lindbergh's technique failed to deliver the promised fuel savings, they'd be calculating glide ratios over the open ocean. "Tommy's flying your wing today," MacDonald said, indicating where Major Thomas Maguire was completing his own pre-flight inspection, a couple of aircraft down the line. "He'll be watching your fuel consumption closely." Maguire looked up at the mention of his name and gave a brief wave. America's second highest scoring ace had volunteered specifically for this mission to observe Lindbergh's methods in action. If the technique worked for someone with Maguire's aggressive flying style, it would likely work for anyone in the squadron. The briefing had been simple: patrol sectors northeast of their current position, with possible ground attack opportunities against Japanese supply installations on several small islands. Nothing extraordinary by their standards, but the distance involved would test both fuel efficiency and human endurance. Lindbergh climbed into his cockpit with practiced ease, his movements sharp and precise. MacDonald watched him run through his checklist, noting that the civilian pilot took extra time adjusting the fuel system configurations. Unlike standard military procedure, Lindbergh set his mixture controls to auto-lean before engine start, and his propeller controls were set to lower RPM than any P-38 pilot had been trained to use. Engine start proceeded as usual, with both Allison V-1710s firing up to their characteristic whine as the turbo superchargers spooled to operating speed. Once taxi clearance came through, MacDonald noticed the difference immediately. Lindbergh's engines ran noticeably quieter than the standard settings, their exhaust note deeper and less aggressive. Hollandia Tower. Lightning flight requesting takeoff clearance, MacDonald transmitted. Lightning flight cleared for takeoff. Runway 27, winds calm, visibility unlimited, came the response. The four P-38s lifted off in formation, climbing steadily through 3,000 feet as they headed northeast toward their patrol area. MacDonald kept his throttles and mixture controls at regulation settings while maintaining visual contact with Lindbergh's aircraft on his right wing. Even during the climb, he could see Lindbergh's engines were developing identical power despite the different configurations. At cruise altitude, the demonstration began in earnest. Lindbergh's voice came over the radio with technical precision, reducing RPM to 1600, manifold pressure 30 in, mixture auto-lean, airspeed 185 indicated. MacDonald cross-checked his own instruments. His aircraft was consuming fuel at the expected rate of about 52 gallons per hour per engine, totaling 104. But visual observation suggested Lindbergh's aircraft was maintaining identical airspeed and altitude despite its radically different engine settings. The first hour passed uneventfully, with navigation proceeding exactly as planned. MacDonald found himself checking the fuel flow instruments more frequently than usual, comparing his consumption rates with mission planning calculations. Everything matched expected performance, which made Lindbergh's claim seem increasingly significant. If the civilian pilot was truly achieving a 30% fuel savings while maintaining cruise performance, the implications for Pacific operations were staggering. McGuire's voice broke the radio silence at the 1 hour 30-minute mark. Lead, I'm showing fuel flow approximately 20% below normal for this phase of flight. The transmission confirmed what MacDonald had begun to suspect. Even McGuire, flying with standard cruise settings but closely observing Lindbergh's technique, was unconsciously adopting more efficient power management. The psychological effect of seeing fuel conservation in action was influencing the flying habits across the formation. 2 hours into the mission, they encountered their first tactical situation. Intelligence reports had indicated possible Japanese barge traffic near Samate Island, and visual reconnaissance confirmed several targets anchored in a protected cove. Standard attack procedure called for high-speed passes with full power settings, the kind of fuel-intensive maneuvering that made long-range missions problematic. Lightning flight. This is lead. Target area ahead. Prepare for ground attack, MacDonald transmitted. He pushed his throttles forward, feeling both engines respond with increased power as fuel flow jumped to maximum combat settings. The attack run proceeded as planned, with diving approaches, multiple strafing passes and defensive maneuvers to avoid anti-aircraft fire followed. But MacDonald noticed that Lindbergh maintained formation throughout the engagement. His aircraft responded normally to combat power demands despite the unconventional cruise configuration. The engagement lasted 12 minutes, with all 4 aircraft expending significant ammunition against barges and shore installations. During the climb back to cruise altitude, MacDonald reset his engines to standard long-range settings while monitoring the remaining fuel. Combat power had consumed fuel at expected rates, leaving him with approximately 60% capacity for the return flight. Lead fuel check, MacDonald transmitted. 2, showing 60% remaining, came Maguire's reply. 3, 58%. 4, 72% remaining, Lindbergh reported quietly. MacDonald double-checked his radio, certain he'd misheard the transmission. 72%. After 2 hours of cruise flight and 12 minutes of combat maneuvering, Lindbergh still had nearly 3 to 4 of his fuel load remaining. The numbers defied everything MacDonald understood about P-38 fuel consumption. Say again, fuel remaining. 72% confirmed, Lindbergh replied. Fuel flow during cruise has averaged approximately 70 gallons per hour total. The mathematics were undeniable. While MacDonald's aircraft had consumed roughly 200 gallons during the first phase of the mission, Lindbergh had used only 140 gallons for the same distance and flight time. The 30% reduction in consumption was exactly what Lindbergh had promised during the briefing. But seeing it demonstrated under combat conditions turned theoretical possibilities into operational reality. The return flight provided additional confirmation. Despite maintaining formation, airspeed, and altitude, Lindbergh's fuel consumption remained consistently lower than standard cruise settings. By the time Hollandia came into sight, MacDonald was calculating fuel margins that seemed almost luxurious compared to their usual tight planning. Landing revealed the full extent of the success. Ground crews immediately began fuel measurements using calibrated dipsticks to determine exact consumption for each aircraft. MacDonald had returned with 18% fuel remaining, enough for mission completion, but offering little reserve for unexpected circumstances. Lindbergh climbed out of his cockpit with 34% fuel still in his tanks. The skepticism cracked first among the ground crews. Technical Sergeant Mike Kowalski, who had been working on P-38 engines since before Pearl Harbor, understood fuel consumption as deeply as a banker understood compound interest, through daily, meticulous observation of numbers that never lied. When Lindbergh's Lightning consistently returned from missions with fuel readings that defied every manual Kowalski had studied, the veteran mechanic began asking questions that cut through the military hierarchy. Colonel MacDonald. "Sir," Kowalski said after the 5th consecutive mission, where Lindbergh's fuel consumption ran 30% below standard rates. "Either this civilian's got magic engines, or everything we've been taught about cruise settings is wrong." MacDonald found himself nodding more frequently during these conversations. The evidence was mounting with mathematical precision that couldn't be ignored. Mission after mission, Lindbergh returned with fuel quantities that should have been impossible given the distances flown and time spent airborne. More importantly, his engines showed no signs of the damage that military doctrine insisted would result from over-square operation. The resistance from the pilots proved more stubborn than the mechanical evidence. Lieutenant Hayes, who had volunteered to try Lindbergh's technique on a training flight, returned from his first attempt visibly shaken by the psychological pressure of running engines in configurations that contradicted everything he'd been taught. It felt wrong the entire time. "Sir," Hayes reported to MacDonald, "like waiting for something to explode." But Hayes also reported fuel consumption that matched Lindbergh's claims almost exactly, 73 gallons per hour total, compared to his usual 100-plus gallon burn rate. The lieutenant's fuel gauges didn't care about his psychological discomfort. They simply recorded the mathematical reality of improved efficiency. Major Peterson represented the old guard's final stand against the new technique. A veteran of missions over heavily defended Japanese positions, Peterson had survived by following procedures that kept his aircraft flying when other pilots pushed their luck too far. "Mr. Lindbergh," he said during one particularly heated discussion in the operations tent, "you're asking us to bet our lives on techniques that go against everything we know about engine management." Lindbergh's response carried the patient tone of someone accustomed to technical skepticism. Major, what you know about engine management comes from training designed for different operational requirements, short duration flights, maximum power settings, and conservative safety margins appropriate for training environments. He gestured toward the mission planning board, covered with routes stretching hundreds of miles across empty ocean. These missions demand efficiency techniques that weren't part of standard military curriculum. The breakthrough came during a mission to Wewak. On July 28th, MacDonald had planned the strike as a standard formation attack against Japanese supply installations, but intelligence reports suggested heavy fighter opposition. The kind of extended air-to-air combat that would test every aspect of aircraft performance and fuel management. The mission tested Lindbergh's performance under the most demanding conditions possible. He flew on Maguire's wing that day, positioning himself where the squadron's most experienced combat pilot could observe his techniques in actual aerial combat. The mission profile called for a 400-mile transit to the target area, followed by potential air-to-air engagement, ground attack, and return flight. It was exactly the kind of complex operation where fuel management could be the difference between mission success and disaster. As predicted by intelligence, they encountered Japanese aircraft, a formation of Mitsubishi K-51 dive bombers escorted by Zero fighters approaching Wewak from the northwest. The engagement began with standard tactics, altitude advantage, coordinated attacks, and aggressive maneuvers to gain firing positions. But as the dogfight extended beyond the expected duration, fuel consumption became a critical factor for every pilot involved. MacDonald watched the aerial combat unfold with the detached precision of a commander who had witnessed too many similar engagements. The P-38s maneuvered against Japanese fighters in a three-dimensional chess match where split-second decisions determined survival. Ammunition expenditure, fuel burn rates, and tactical positioning all played a role in the calculations pilots made instinctively while pulling multiple Gs in combat turns. The Japanese formation leader, later identified as Captain Saburo Shimatada, demonstrated the kind of aggressive flying that had made Zero pilots legendary in the early war years. Shimatada's aircraft cut through defensive maneuvers with the precision of someone with hundreds of combat hours, forcing American pilots to respond with maximum power settings, which consumed fuel at rates far above normal cruise consumption. Maguire's voice crackled through the radio during a brief lull in the engagement. Multiple bandits, ammunition running low, fuel becoming a factor. It was the kind of situation that separated experienced combat pilots from those who hadn't yet learned to manage multiple crisis factors simultaneously. Ammunition, fuel, enemy aircraft capabilities, distance to base, and weather conditions all demanded immediate evaluation while maintaining situational awareness. In three-dimensional combat, Lindbergh's aircraft maneuvered through the engagement with the same precise control he demonstrated during cruise flight. No wasted motion, no unnecessary power settings, and consistent tactical positioning suggested complete comfort with the P-38's handling characteristics. When Shimatada's damaged aircraft turned directly toward Lindbergh in what appeared to be a ramming attack, Lindbergh's response was immediate and decisive. The brief engagement ended with Shimatada's aircraft spiraling toward the ocean, trailing smoke and debris. Lindbergh had scored his first and only aerial victory of the war, but the significance extended beyond individual success. He had proven that fuel-efficient cruise techniques didn't compromise combat effectiveness when applied by pilots who understood both engine management and tactical flying. The return flight provided final confirmation of the technique's practical value. MacDonald's formation had been airborne for over 8 hours, including extended combat maneuvering at maximum power settings. Standard fuel planning would have left most pilots calculating emergency landing options or considering water landings if headwinds increased. Instead, they landed at Hollandia with fuel reserves that seemed almost luxurious. MacDonald touched down with enough fuel remaining for another hour of flight. Maguire who had been experimenting with modified cruise settings throughout the mission, reported similar margins, but Lindbergh's fuel gauges still showed quantities that seemed impossible. He had enough fuel left for nearly 2 additional hours of flight time. The ground crew's post-flight inspections revealed no engine damage, no unusual wear patterns, and no mechanical problems that would suggest harmful effects from the over-square operation. Kowalski's detailed examination of Lindbergh's engines even showed slightly less wear than comparable aircraft operated under standard settings, suggesting that efficient cruise techniques might actually extend engine life rather than shorten it. Word of the combat success spread quickly through the 475th Fighter Group. Lindbergh had demonstrated fuel efficiency under the most demanding operational conditions, proven combat effectiveness against experienced enemy pilots, and returned with engine conditions that contradicted every warning about over-square damage. That evening, Major Peterson approached MacDonald with the grudging respect of someone whose professional skepticism had been overcome by undeniable evidence. "Colonel, I'd like to request permission to try Mr. Lindbergh's techniques on tomorrow's patrol mission." The dam had finally broken. Within a week, every pilot in the squadron was experimenting with reduced RPM settings and auto-Leon mixtures. The results matched Lindbergh's predictions with mathematical consistency: 30% fuel savings, extended range capabilities, and no mechanical issues that hadn't been predicted by outdated training doctrine. MacDonald realized they had witnessed more than a technical demonstration. They had seen institutional knowledge challenged and overturned by real-world, practical results. By August 1944, the transformation was complete. What began as a controversial suggestion from one civilian had evolved into standard operating procedure across every P-38 unit in the Pacific Theater. Flight manuals were quickly revised, technical orders rewritten, and instructor pilots found themselves teaching methods that directly contradicted everything they had learned during their own training. The institutional revolution happened swiftly, driven by results that commanders could no longer ignore. MacDonald stood in the operations tent, studying mission planning boards that would have been impossible just months earlier. Routes stretched deep into Japanese-held territory, 950-mile round trips to Balikpapan, extended patrols over the Celebes Sea, and escort missions that pushed P-38 capabilities to limits that previous doctrine had considered fantasy. The numbers told the story with mathematical precision. Combat radius increased from 570 miles to 750 miles. Fuel consumption reduced by 30%, and mission capability expanded by 40% in flight time. Colonel Lewis approached with the latest operational reports, his expression showing the satisfaction of an officer whose tactical problems had been solved by unexpected innovation. The 402nd Squadron completed an 8-hour escort mission to Borneo yesterday, he reported. Full formation, no fuel emergencies, and adequate reserves for combat maneuvering over the target. The significance wasn't lost on MacDonald. 8-hour missions had been theoretical just 4 months earlier, but now they were routine operations that pilots planned with confidence, not desperate hope. The psychological transformation mirrored the technical advancement. Crews no longer calculated fuel margins with the grim precision of men expecting to die from empty tanks over endless ocean. Technical Sergeant Kowalski had become an unexpected expert on the new procedures, training ground crews throughout the Pacific on mixture settings and power management techniques that maximized fuel efficiency. His maintenance reports consistently showed engine conditions that matched or exceeded standard operational parameters, disproving decades of warnings about over-square damage. Engines operated under Mr. Lindbergh's settings are actually showing less wear than comparable aircraft run at standard cruise power, Kowalski reported during a maintenance briefing. Lower combustion temperatures, reduced mechanical stress, and improved fuel atomization are extending service life rather than shortening it. The technical vindication went beyond mechanical validation. It indicated that institutional knowledge, codified in training manuals and perpetuated through military instruction, could be fundamentally wrong about basic operational principles. The implications reached far beyond fuel consumption, raising questions about how military organizations evaluated and adopted new information. Lieutenant Hayes, now one of the squadron's most vocal advocates for the new techniques, had personally flown over 200 hours using Lindbergh's methods. His logbook documented fuel savings that translated into tactical advantages, measurable in combat effectiveness. "Sir," he told MacDonald during a mission debrief, "yesterday's patrol to Halmahera would have been impossible under old cruise settings. We flew for 9 hours, engaged enemy aircraft over the target, and landed with fuel remaining for another hour of flight." The human element had proven as adaptable as the technical systems. Pilots who initially worried about 9-hour endurance missions discovered that the reduced engine noise and vibration from lower RPM settings actually decreased fatigue during extended flights. Cockpit comfort improved, oxygen system demands remained manageable, and the psychological pressure of fuel calculations diminished to acceptable levels. Major Maguire had become the most effective advocate of the new techniques among combat pilots. His reputation carried weight throughout the fighter community, and his endorsement of Lindbergh's methods influenced pilots across multiple squadrons. "The old way of thinking about fuel management was killing us," Maguire observed during a gathering of squadron leaders. "Not through mechanical failure, but through self-imposed limitations that prevented us from reaching targets that should have been within our capability." The strategic implications became clear as mission planners realized that P-38 units could now strike targets previously reserved for longer-range bombers. Japanese installations that had been beyond fighter reach were suddenly accessible to formations capable of flying nearly 10 hours with adequate fuel reserves for combat operations. The tactical balance in the Pacific shifted as American fighters gained operational range that matched the vast distances of oceanic warfare. Word of the fuel efficiency breakthroughs spread through unofficial channels, connecting P-38 pilots across the entire Pacific theater. Squadron commanders from Australia to the Aleutians began requesting detailed briefings on the cruise techniques that promised to extend their operational capabilities. The informal communication network among fighter pilots transmitted technical information faster than official military channels. MacDonald found himself fielding requests from units as far away as the China-Burma-India theater, where P-38 pilots faced similar range limitations over equally challenging terrain. The techniques Lindbergh had demonstrated over Pacific waters proved equally effective over Himalayan peaks and Burmese jungles, confirming that fuel efficiency principles transcended specific operational environments. By late 1944, training squadrons in the United States had incorporated the new cruise procedures into standard curricula. Newly graduated pilots arrived in Pacific combat units already familiar with techniques their predecessors had learned through dangerous trial and error over hostile territory. The institutional learning curve had been compressed from months of combat experience into weeks of systematic training. The statistical evidence became overwhelming as operational reports accumulated. Pilot survival rates improved measurably as fuel-related emergencies decreased. Mission success rates increased as formations could remain over target areas for extended periods. Enemy installations previously protected by distance became vulnerable to regular attacks by fighters, capable of reaching them with adequate fuel reserves. Lindbergh's departure from Hollandia in August 1944 marked the end of his direct involvement with Pacific operations, but his technical contributions continued to influence combat effectiveness throughout the remaining war years. He left behind a cadre of pilots and ground crews who understood fuel management principles that would serve as a foundation for jet-powered aircraft development in the post-war era. The institutional lesson extended beyond aviation into broader questions about military doctrine and innovation. The P-38 fuel efficiency breakthrough demonstrated that conventional wisdom, even when supported by extensive training programs and technical documentation, could be fundamentally wrong about basic operational principles. The speed with which new techniques replaced established procedures suggested that military organizations could adapt rapidly when presented with evidence that couldn't be dismissed. McDonnell's final mission report to higher headquarters quantified the transformation in terms that spoke directly to strategic planners. Combat radius extended by 31%, fuel consumption reduced by 30%, and mission duration capability increased by 40%. These numbers translated into tactical advantages that influenced air campaign planning throughout the Pacific Theater and established precedents for long-range fighter operations that would continue through the Korean War and beyond. The quiet revolution that began with one civilian suggestion to try different engine settings had fundamentally changed how America's most important fighter aircraft operated in the world's largest theater of war. The lesson was both simple and profound. Sometimes the experts are wrong, and sometimes saving fuel means winning battles.